Right, well, it's wonderful to see you all, or not see you in some cases, but I'm just going to start now because we don't have that much time and there is a lot of stuff about this source I want to talk to you about. Now, first things first, my name is Gianno Balestriere, or Volker Bachmann daily. I've been in the SCA on and off for about 20 years now, living in the Kingdom of Drachenwald, and most of my interest has been cooking. Some of you may know either the SCA name or the mundane name, written a couple things. And today I would like to talk about a source that, well, it's not new, it's been around for 500 years, but it was relatively new to me when I started engaging thoroughly with it, and it's a really interesting text. Some of you may have noticed, may have been following this, I've posted some recipes from it online when I started translating in March. I've stopped doing this lately, partly because I simply didn't have time anymore, and partly because I have written to Prospect Books in the UK about the possibility of publishing a full translation. So that may happen, knock on wood. But today I want to introduce the source and talk a little bit more about who Anna Wecker is and why this is interesting. So let's begin. Assuming this works. You should now be able to see my PowerPoint presentation. Is it working?
I can see part of it.
Yeah, what's missing?
I'm only seeing the left side of the slide.
Oops, okay.
Is anyone else able to see the full slide, or is it just me?
I think it needs to be resized.
Yeah, I'm in the same. I see like the upper left corner.
That's not good. Okay. Let's see if, is it working better now?
No, still seeing the same view.
Okay, then I'm going to need to try and do something else. No. Okay, let's see if this works any better.
Oh, yes.
Yes, can you see it better now?
Yes.
Okay, right. Then let's hope that this works. I can't actually see any of you anymore at this point, but let's get started. Okay, now the first thing and the one thing that, if you have heard of Anna Wecker, the one thing that you've probably heard about her is that this is the first cookbook authored by a woman, her Köstlich Neu Kochbuch. That may be true, or it may not. And one of the first things is that we can't know that. We can know a fair bit about her. We know a good deal about her cookbook, and it is impressive for all kinds of reasons, but it is probably not the first cookbook written by a woman. It is only the first one where we can actually be very sure that it is. There is, even in the German corpus, there are several cookbooks that are associated with women that predate her, because her cookbook was printed in 1597. There are, first of all, Sabina and Philippine Welser. There are two manuscripts associated with Sabina Welser and Philippine Welser, both from the Welser family of Augsburg. The family may not mean very much to people today, but these were seriously important people. These were very wealthy, extremely wealthy bankers and merchants. The Welser family at one point held both the right to export African slaves to the Spanish colonies and the governorship of what is today roughly Venezuela on behalf of the Spanish crown, which they'd gotten in return to giving significant loans to the emperor. These are not just a merchant family. These are very, very serious players in international politics. We do not know who Sabina Welser, or in the parlance of the time, Sabina Welserin, was. The manuscript is dated 1553. That is probably accurate, but we can't be sure. There are two persons named Sabina Welser, and either of them might have owned it. There's very little known about her otherwise. Philippine Welser, on the other hand, the owner of the other manuscript, was famous in her day because she, as a non-noble woman, married Archduke Ferdinand of Tyrol, a senior member of the Habsburg house, and ruled as Duchess of Tyrol. That was a scandal of that time. That was a major issue. Both of them left manuscripts that are associated with their names, and the association is solid. This is not just something like, this is the armor of the king of William the Conqueror, or this is the sword of Charlemagne. The associations are solid. These manuscripts belong to the Welser family. What we do not know is who wrote them, because, again, these are seriously wealthy people. Philippine Welser actually employed at one point the master chef, the star chef of her day, Max Rumpold, which means that it is entirely possible that these manuscripts were produced for these women rather than by these women. We do not know that. So possible, but not a given. Then we have Maria Stengler. She is much less well known for various good reasons. Maria Stengler's manuscript comes from Augsburg. The owner is also otherwise unidentified. The Stengler family is known in Augsburg. Maria Stengler. Maria is a very common woman's name at the time. We don't actually know anything about her. Now, here comes the problem. Maria Stengler's book actually does not survive. It's probably a war loss. And if you will allow me to go to the other place, it is available online. It only survives in a very bad 19th century edition. The manuscript itself is probably lost in World War II. It was privately held. It was never very widely known. This is the title page of the edition. The Augsburger Kochbuch, darinnen enthalten. This is the Augsburg cookbook containing excellent recipes for women and maidens. The title is completely fictitious. It was not called that. It was never called that. The arms are fictitious. This was printed in 1886 privately, and the actual title on the first page is, "This cookbook belongs to the maiden Maria Stenglerin, date 1554. That's so close to the Welserin cookbook that it's entirely plausible that this is an example of personal competition, that the Stengler family decided, hey, the Welser family has this. This is something you must have. So let's also have one. The actual recipes have been modernized. So as you can see here, this is what they look like. It's a nice 19th century print face, easy to read. We cannot be sure that the reading is accurate. The original does not survive. This is pretty much disastrous. But if you want it, this is where you will find it. Professor Gloning has been kind enough to scan the whole thing and put it online, make it available to all of us. And I have read it, I have used it. The recipes look plausible. It is very likely that there is an actual source at the bottom of it all. But yeah, we don't have very much left of it. So Maria Stenglerin. The next thing is, of course, that There are also a lot of cookbooks that are not associated with any given individual, and any one of them, many of them, might very well have been written by women, and we simply don't know. So, was Anna Weckerin the first woman to ever write a cookbook? Probably not. She was, however, the first woman to get one printed. That has something to do with her background, which is a really interesting thing. Though not probably as big a thing as we think today, because print and manuscript today and then are a slightly different story. When we look at manuscripts, we think that this is something that you do privately. This is something you do for your own private amusement. This is not really significant. Significant books get printed. It wasn't like that. It wasn't like that in the 16th century. Manuscripts still carried a good deal of status. Manuscripts could even be more important than printed books. And people produced manuscripts for their own use, or had them professionally produced for their own use, because they wanted them bespoke sometimes. There wasn't just one business model in town. If you were a poet, if you were a writer, and you depended on patronage, which very often you had to, because printing books didn't actually pay the bills, then making manuscripts and giving them to people who you could hope for patronage from was actually a good model. Even with cookbooks, it wasn't that there was the printed material and the lesser stuff. Trude Ehlert, who is doyen of German cookbook research, did a study on the Küchenmeisterei, the earliest printed cookbook in German, and its attendant manuscripts. And it is really interesting to see that the first printed cookbook was copied in manuscript several times. Changes were made to these manuscripts to suit the owner's needs. And that some of these changes are found in subsequent editions of the print cookbook. Manuscript was very much alive. Having a cookbook in manuscript form did not make it inferior to a printed one. But by 1591, if you wanted to become known, if you wanted to become a household name, then print was absolutely what you needed. And that's how she managed. Printing cookbooks had been around for a while at this point, actually more than 100 years. The very earliest, the very first German cookbook that was printed was the Küchenmeisterei, the Mastery of the Kitchen, in 1490. This is the title page of the original. Relatively soon after that, the next big German cookbook that made it into print actually was not the cookbook. Actually, was not originally a German cookbook. It was Platina, Platina's De Honesta Voluptate, translated into German in the 1520s and put into print. Platina was so successful that several reprints of the Küchenmeisterei purported to be Platina's cookbook, which anybody who's read it would tell you that's not possible. They are totally different beasts. But yes, Platina was very successful in print. And in the 1550s, we get the next successful German cookbook by Balthasar Steindl. Balthasar Steindl was a physician in Dillingen, where John Dillinger comes from, by the way, in Dillingen. In the 1560s, we get the Ars Magirica, that is printed in Switzerland, and it is in Latin, which incidentally is very useful access to the German tradition for those who don't read German but do read Latin. The Ars Magirica is very much a cookbook of its time, but written in Latin is accessible. And yes, like so many of the other cookbooks of this kind, you find them online. You find these cookbooks online. Go. This is a copy of the Ars Magirica, full length, online. The Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft was kind enough to make this available to us. Jodocus Willich, a contemporary of Gessner, of Konrad Gessner, and actually printed with Jakob Gessner, a relative of Konrad Gessner, in 1563. This book is absolutely fascinating. And it also includes the famous letter about cheese making in the Alps. Definitely grab it, do look at it, do read it. It is a fascinating text. I didn't use it very much because it is more on the border. It is from Switzerland. It is in Latin. It's very classical stuff, but it is an absolutely fascinating text. So printed cookbooks were very familiar at the time, and by the end, very close to the time of, by the end of the 16th century, very close to the time of Anna Weckerin, you have Max Rumpold, who redefines the way cookbooks are written in German. Max Rumpold's cookbook gets reprinted for over 100 years, again and again. He was a court cook, a very important man in his time. Other works of food literature were also making it into print. There were medical works, books about how to cook for convalescents, books about the medical properties of foods. There were botanical works. Clusius, Charles de Cluse, was a botanist who worked for the emperor, but also Hieronymus Bock, but also Leonhard Fuchs. Kräuterbücher were very popular. Horticulture was a popular hobby with the nobility and with the upper bourgeoisie. These people kept lovely gardens and they paid a lot of attention to the vegetables they ate. Beer got its own poet, Heinrich Knaust, 5 Bücher über die Braukunst. 5 books about the qualities of beer. It's basically a guide to the beers of Germany. Absolutely fascinating reading, unfortunately untranslated. Milk got its own in the Libellus de Lacte, de Operis Lactaribus, again, also available in Latin. Unfortunately not online. They really need to do something about it, but it's held in Switzerland and they're not that good about putting stuff online. And Hieronymus Bock, more noted as a botanist, also wrote the Deutsche Speiskammer, the German larder in the 1550s, an angry response to Platina, where he's basically getting up and writing a book saying, but German food is really, really good. Much, much better than Italian, which he has a hard time in self-believing sometimes. You could absolutely see him with a red cap and make German food great again. But it is a fascinating book because he talks about all kinds of details that people usually take for granted or leave out in cookbooks, about where the best bread in Germany is made and what it is made from, where the various wines come from, who uses what kind of vinegar, what kind of spices and herbs are in, kind of herbs and fruit are in season when. It is an absolutely fascinating reading. Now, this is the publishing world that Anna Wecker comes into. This is the world that she knows, and we will see that she knows this very well. What do we know about her? Well, depressingly little. She was born at an unknown date sometime around mid-century, very likely, somewhere in the Nuremberg region, very likely. She died in 1596 in Altdorf, near Nuremberg. Now, she was married twice, that much we know, and it is very likely, some sources get this wrong, but her first marriage was to the city secretary of Altdorf, one Israel Aschenberger. The second was to a physician, Johann Jakob Wecker, who lived in Colmar. She published under his name, Anna Weckerin. In is the female suffix, so Weckerin means wife or woman of the Wecker family. She had at least one daughter who lived in Altdorf and who she lived with after being widowed for the second time. She was, in her time, an author of published poetry. She wrote German poems that made it into print, and she helped edit her husband's books, both in German and in Latin. What does that tell us about her? Well, number one, she was an educated woman. Number two, she understood how the printing business worked, because she worked with printers and publishers. Number three, city physicians, city secretaries, these are highly educated people. She was as close to nobility as you get without having a noble title. She was a woman of significance, a woman of substance. People listened when she spoke. And this is an interesting little detail. She knew that, or at least her publisher knew that. These are the frontispieces. On the left, you see the image that accompanied Anna Wecker's Köstlich Neue Kochbuch. You've already seen it on the introductory page. On the right, you see the image that accompanied the 1581 edition of Marx Rompold's Neue Kochbuch. Now, Marx Rompold was by any account a star. He was head cook to the Electus Spiritual of Mainz. He was a cookbook author, of course. He wrote an encyclopedic cookbook that basically overshadowed everything else published in the century in German. And he had no lack of self-esteem. This is, if you read his cookbook, and you can in English, it's been translated, I'm extremely grateful for that effort. You just get the sense that he takes himself very seriously. He is proud of his craft. He is a man who understands his worth, the value of his experience. And just compare the two pictures. That's Anna Wecker there on the left, standing in the kitchen, instructing her her servant in how to prepare the food properly. Look at the equipment, look at the layout of the picture. There is no way the publisher did not use that as his example. There is no way he did not consciously emulate Marx Rompold. And obviously, Marx Rompold is the role model to go by. So this is not a small addition to the great stock of knowledge. She takes herself seriously enough to want that. And in her world, that made sense. So where does she come from? She comes not from anywhere. She comes from the cities of Germany, and these were a unique place, a strange place, but a unique place. Just a moment. I can't get shut. Yeah, there we are. Excellent, excellent. Yes. The free cities of Germany were politically very significant places. Germany was politically divided. Many of the cities were either relatively independent or even only directly dependent on the emperor. But unlike in contemporary Italy, they were not city-states. They didn't have a contado, they didn't have a hinterland. Most of them controlled very little territory. It ended shortly after the war, so they needed close political and economic relations with surrounding territories. It was a fairly unique system, and every city had its own government. Every city had its own elites. The educated burghers and the merchant classes were the leading citizens. People who had capital to invest, people who owned real estate, people who owned capital stock, merchandise, and so on. Not so much the artisans. The people who worked with their hands were always in a more precarious position, and that carried over into all kinds of unpleasant confrontations that we can't go into detail with now. But if you were a city secretary, if you were a city physician, if you were in these positions, then you had studied, you had a university degree, and you were associated with the ruling class. And this is the world that she belongs to. These are people whose governments are accustomed to micromanaging things. They regulate things. They love regulation. And Nuremberg particularly was the place to go to. This is a vista of Nuremberg in the 1490s. If you look closely, you will see in front here there are gallows. The place of execution is here. A reminder that government was serious about upholding order. Nuremberg was known for good governance well beyond its immediate surroundings. The cities around it had largely adopted the Nuremberg law and the Nuremberg system. As late as the early 17th century, people would come from England and France to visit Nuremberg to learn about urban government. So sometimes the way urban planners go to Singapore today. This is the environment where Anna Wecker probably grew up. We don't know whether she is from Nuremberg herself, but she lived for a long time in the cities around Nuremberg. Nuremberg had a territory. It was one of the few cities that did, but it was not very large. Later, she lived in Colmar in Alsace. Today, that's in France. This is what the inner city of Colmar looks like today. It's a very touristy place, very popular. And those houses, well, we don't know if she lived in any of them, obviously, but those houses are from the time of Anna Wecker. They were built around the 16th century. This is what Colmar looked like. She died in Altdorf, which is near Nuremberg, a small city that was under Nuremberg law. And the book was printed in Amberg, also near Nuremberg. Her husband was associated with Basel, another city today in Switzerland, which was also a free, a relatively independent city, and one with a strong tradition of the bourgeois government. This is the world that Anna Wecker comes from, and it is not a courtly world. It is not a world of nobility. It is not a world that is centered on a king or an emperor. It is a world that is centered on a household and on professional people, people who have serious amounts of money, who have very significant standing in their community, but who are also very consciously not courtly. Right. And now I would like to take a look at the recipes, at some of the recipes. Before we do that, has anybody got any questions that can't wait? Right. Then let's continue and look at some of the recipes. I've just picked out a few because this is what makes this book really interesting. The recipes are fascinating. Here's the first one. This is just a fairly basic recipe. It's allerhand eingemachte Hühner für die Kranken. That is chickens cooked in sauce for sick people. Eingemacht is an interesting word, but let's not go into the linguistics too much. What you do is you take chicken, half or a quarter of a well-prepared chicken, and you add water and meat broth mixed, or if you do not have that, you add other meat, so you make a good thin soup. In this liquid, you cook it, and you put in young spinach and lettuce. Lettuce actually makes a very satisfying pot herb, and we have a parallel for this recipe in Sabina Welserin, where you also cook the chicken with lettuce. Quite good. And here, this is fascinating. She gives all these details, like you clean the young spinach and lettuce, you wash it cleanly and spin the water from it as though for a salad. So she describes this in another recipe. You are supposed to put it in a cloth and actually spin it in circles to dry it. You grasp it together and make one cut through it, and you add it to the chicken and let it boil until it is done. You serve it alongside the soup or all together. And then we get details on additions. Parsley roots, they give strength and flavor to soups. And take the chicken when it is almost cooked and put it in another vessel, and take the greens and spinach or young chard, that also works. And the chicken together with the greens should be moist, but not sodden. She says brühig. And you can add vinegar to this. So here we have a variety of the dish that is drier and more solid, more substantial. She intends this for sick people, but in other recipe books, we have similar recipes that are simply described without any comment. What I think is really interesting about this recipe, aside from the fact that you put lettuce as a pot herb, is it's got very detailed instructions of some of the processes. And that's typical for Anna Weckerin. That is typical for her book. You very often get a glimpse of how practically something is done. She doesn't simply assume that you know. She will take the time to explain how to cut, for example, spinach. If it just says cut, here it says make one cut through it. So you leave it fairly coarse. You cut the leaves in half, basically. It still doesn't help as much as it would, because we're not quite sure how big lettuce leaves would have been, but with reference to contemporary herbals, we can get a little closer to that. Here's another one. This is one that I love because it is so modern, looks so modern, almond tart. And here we actually get quantities, so we get an idea of what it looks like. You need half a pound of finely pounded almonds, 4 or 5 eggs. You strain the eggs. She calls it remove the birds. What she means, of course, is remove the small elements of fertilization that may or may not be present. Take skimmed off cream, as much, that is the same quantity as the eggs, of skimmed off cream that has been boiled. You add rose water and sugar and a little grated white bread. Here we don't get in exact quantities, but it's a rough idea, and it tells us how big the tart will end up being. Next, make a pastry crust, as you do all the time. This is something, unfortunately, I still haven't found a pastry crust recipe in Anna Wecker. There is one in Sabina Welser. Right, and you can shape it round or shape it as a heart, fill in the stuff, das Zeug, that is the filling that you made, and bake it at a gentle heat. When it is firmed up, you brush it with rose water and strew sugar on it, or you make a paste from egg white, rose water, and sugar and spread it on that. This paste is really interesting. Give it a good heat, then it rises and glistens like a marzipan, which you brush the same way. And it saves sugar. When the egg whites are well beaten, you may leave out the rose water or use very little. Now, you beat the egg whites. This is the first time she says it. And you beat the egg whites, you add sugar and rose water, and what you can get is something meringue-like. It's not like a modern meringue. I made it like that once for fun, for giggles, and it worked, but it sounds like a thin paste. And if you spread that on, it can be very, very nice. Next, she gives more possibilities. If you like, and if you can, you may cut a very tender lid that is very broad, or a nice rope. Make a dough from egg whites, sugar, and rose water, and roll it out well. So here, you use more sugar, and you make something that is more like a sugar paste. And you put this covering on top. I have never tried this. I'm not good with sugar, but I'm pretty sure that you can make a satisfactory sugar paste with egg whites and rose water. And it's probably going to be possible to roll it out and put it over an almond tart. What I find interesting about this recipe is especially the beginning. Again, we have parallels to this recipe. Almond tarts show up almost everywhere. They're very common in the corpus. We find one in Sabina Welserin. She takes a long time with the almond tart, with various almond tarts. But here we have number 1, the topping, and number 2, the quantities. That's what I find again and again very fascinating about Anna Wecker. She also dedicates a long chapter to cheeses and their uses. And this is going to be a little more complicated. She's talking about Züge. Ziege or Züge are fresh cheeses. The word is probably not associated with the word Ziege, which means goat, but the etymology is uncertain. We know that the Ziege or Züge is not just made from goat milk, it's made from all kinds of milk, and it's basically peasant cheese. So all the Züge of plain milk, simple milk of sheep, goats, or cows are made as is written of the almond Züge before. She starts out with an instruction of how to make it from almond milk, because of course that is the genteel way of doing it. But realistically, nobody could possibly afford to always make it from almond milk. So you did what you could. And she talks a lot about the Scheidmolke or Scheidmolk. That is the acidic way that you use from one batch to another. She says it's best to obtain that from those who make cheese and churn butter. Just as you can sometimes get the Züge from those people. So this is something you would be expected to buy on the market. Peasants would bring cheese to the market. People who kept larger numbers of cows or goats would sell cheese, and they would also sell the whey. But if you cannot get it, then you can also use wine or vinegar. And she says, do not do too much that it does not become sour. So you should be careful when you do that, because the Züge, the cheese, becomes sour. Best to get the Scheidmolk, get the acidic way. And then she tells us something really interesting. The whey gets poured off into a clean dish until it settles. And then you pour off the clear liquid into a pitcher or small pot that is new. This is always very important. Pottery cooking dishes at the time in a household of her economic level were basically disposable. You used them until they were no longer good. But for some purposes, you wanted a new one. This is one of them. You keep it in a place that is not too warm, well closed. So you store this way until you make cheese again. And you wish to use it, remove the skin if it has formed and pour that into the liquid which you want to separate. It doesn't matter if the skin is gray or yellow, the liquid underneath stays good. That's a technique I had not come across with this early, and it's really interesting. She writes about cheese making a lot. I have translated about half of her cheese making recipes by now. The instructions make most sense if you really read them together, because she never systematically describes all the steps of the process, but she does it in a couple of instances, sometimes this, sometimes that. I found this one the most interesting because that's totally convincing. You would keep the acidic whey and use it for cheese making again and again and again. And that means bacterial cultures, definitely. You are basically raising your own cheese making bacterial cultures here. This is another one, a parallel in Welserin again. This is, there is no way this was actually meant for convalescent people, but she includes it, perhaps, possibly because to show that she knows how, possibly because somebody actually really liked it. It is how you can cook a chicken in a really dramatic and grand way in a beef stomach. You take a good fat hen, you scald it, you prepare it as it should be. This is something you're expected to know. You beat 6 or 8 eggs, chop good fragrant herbs, parsley, marjoram, and thyme, very small raisins and grapes if you wish young spinach. You season it well with saffron, pepper, and sweet spices, salt it properly, and add sweet fat. That's the filling for the chicken. I assume that the eggs are cooked because they are in parallel instances. I can't be sure though, but I assume that you cook the eggs before you put them inside the chicken. Stuffing chicken with eggs is a German cooking habit. It is actually at the time referred to as the German style. You add various other things. Very often it's fruit. Here it's herbs and spices and raisins. And it goes back all the way to the Lorscher Arzneibuch in the late 8th century, which has instructions for that chickens should only ever be stuffed with the egg yolks, not the whites. Right. You tie the chicken shut at the neck, pour the above mentioned stuff into it, and sew it shut. So quite possibly raw eggs. I'm not sure if that works, but yeah. If you wish, brown it in fat, like before, like preserved. That is eingebickte chickens. I think she means confitted. She does refer to the process of making a confit, but I'm not entirely sure whether that's what she means here. And then you put it into a beef stomach along with sufficient sliced almonds, raisins, and grapes, and also sew shut the stomach. And you place it by the fire in boiling water and let it cook slowly until it can be roasted. And then you take it out, place it in a pan with hot fat, or in hot fat, she says. I don't think she means deep fry. That would be overkill. I don't think that large size of an object for deep frying is realistic for her kitchen, and any bourgeois kitchen at the time. But putting it in a pan, browning it on all sides, absolutely. Maybe even pouring hot fat over it. You stick the stomach with cinnamon and cloves. So basically you stick them all over it. And also the hen before you put it in the stomach. Thank you for telling us now. And you brown it. And you pour off the hot fat and make a broth to go over it. A stately dish. I can imagine that this must have been very impressive to look at and quite possibly quite tasty. What I like about it is, again, that she is very careful to try to explain how to do it. And then comes this, stick the stomach well with cinnamon and cloves, and also the hen before you put it in. It really pays to read the recipes all the way through. There's another interesting one. Pastries of leftover meat. I actually tried that today. It worked very well. She has 2 recipes for this. They are basically the same, and if you read both of them, you get the full set of information. It's also playful, and this is another thing that she does a lot. She likes to play with her food. 16th century Germans generally like to play with their food. She is no exception there. So, pastries of leftover meat. Take of such meat as you have that is no longer suitable for the table, that is good for these things. You cut the meat off the bones and chop it well, and then you make a dough of fine flour and eggs, a little fat, and salt it well. That is what we did today. Or the way you make it for tarts, as you please. She never explains how to make it for tarts. I haven't found it yet. Anyway, so she assumes that is real. You take 2 thin sheets, one as big as the other, you shape it as you would like it, and now comes the playing bit. Round, triangular, or rectangular, into hearts, roses, or stars. And you add good spices to the meat, raisins, what you would like to have, sweet or sour, as you please. Enough fat, Suppenschmalz. Suppenschmalz means fat that is skimmed off from boiling, or beef marrow, according to how fat or lean the meat itself is. This is something we usually don't need to do anymore with modern meat. And you can also add good herbs, or with or without spices, and eggs, as if you wanted to make Klobwürste, that is the fat-lined part of the large intestine, the fat darm, is used for a specific kind of fresh sausage. It's called Klobwurst. You can still get it in Germany. And these would have been bound with eggs. You may also take coarsely ground almonds, but they are better grated, especially if you also add eggs, and also grate a little bit of hard white bread. You have options. Yeah, these are basically just pastries for leftover meat. Now comes the part again about the shapes. If you want to make them, prepare the meat and put a little of it on part of the above mentioned sheet, shaped according to whatever you want of animals, birds, hounds, hares, as described above. Shape it with the prepared stuff, the meat mixture, and then place the second sheet on top. Press it together according to its shape and close it as artfully as you can. So you can, yeah, she wants you to make pastries in the shape of an animal, of a hound or of a hare or whatever, and give each to each its form. Bristles with a pastry wheel to the sow. Give each one eyes from black dried cherries or juniper berries. Arrange the skin of an egg around it. That's the membrane between the shell and the inner of the egg. Or of red apples or rose petals, each after its kind. And then she talks about this. I have kept little sheep's trotters and such things, as well as young hare's feet for these pastries. So they are fairly large. They can actually put real animals' feet on them. Roughly done, she writes, does not improve them or detract from them. She's right there. I did not do mine very artfully, and they still tasted good. Close them, brush them with egg, as is always done. Again, useful information. Bake them quickly and serve them warm. They are best without egg, but to each as they like it. We did not put in egg, but we put in a little bread, no almonds. And then, just a few pages later, this recipe. Take off this stuff, depending on how much or little there is, and remove the meat from the bones. Make a dough of eggs and fine flour and work fat into it. If you wish, make it like any other dough, like other dough for tarts. That is message. I can't open chat. Zoom is not helping. All right. So this is effectively the same recipe. Take the meat and season it, sweet spices, pepper, and a good quantity of saffron. So here we get actual. Mix it with vinegar and meat broth, a good quantity of raisins, or if you wish, leave out the sweet things, and in season with sour grapes are available, add them instead, or sour plums, soaked and steeped a little. But do not put in any spices with sour grapes, except always pepper. So there are varieties that we don't learn about normally, and now she's giving these details. Always add Suppenschmalz, especially with the grapes, unless the meat itself is very fat. And then you prepare it, mix it with beaten eggs, and prepare it as you please. Place it on the rolled dough in the middle of a piece of dough. Put it on that. Rush the lower part well with egg whites so that it raises the upper part. Close it as well as you can and put on it what you wish. And you can make roses, stars, lilies, hounds, hares, pigs, and birds. But you should know that you must roll out a large sheet and form the same stuff with the meat as you want it. this is, I think, a very lovely, interesting instance. Yep. Of course, the raw egg would be a binder. It works without if you chop it fine enough. And yeah, like I said, I've tried it. It worked well. Right. So normally she doesn't give 2 recipes for the same thing, but she gives related recipes, and it's very helpful sometimes. This is the last one I want to present today because it is so strange. Most of her recipes are things that you find elsewhere. She gives more details, sometimes she gives extra detail, but they are things you find described elsewhere. This is something I've never found anywhere else. It really threw me. Spiced pasta, or as she calls it, a hearty dish of dried dough. You make egg pasta, basically. You take eggs, as many as you please. The yolk, just the yolk is best. That is something that you find everywhere in German cookery, and as far as I know, also in other parts. Take the yolk, discard the white if you can afford it. You add pepper, ginger, saffron, nutmeg, and mace, together with all kinds of good spices that please you. You salt it a little, and you stir it into a dough with good flour. And then, if it is not strong enough with spices, season is more as long as it is not strong enough. It should be very dry. If you would have a little sugar in it, that is your choice. She clearly does not approve. You get that a lot. She gives you options, and then she lets you know which options she approves of and which she doesn't. But this is an absolutely fascinating recipe, and I long to try more like that. So a very dry, firm dough with lots of spices, very strong. And then work it as dry as you can. Roll or twist it into thin ribbons, about as thick as a proper knife's back. So just less than ½ centimeter. Cut it as thin as wood shavings or very finely cut root vegetables. That's nice too, because it tells us how finely to cut root vegetables for the upper class kitchen. She refers to this in a couple places where she says, cut apples as you would Rüben, that is root vegetables. This is how thin she wants them cut. Most of us cut them too coarsely for her standards. Roll out the ribbons of dough 3 or 4 fingers wide and then cut them across. That way you get different lengths. So here you don't want consistency. You want a certain variety. You lay it out on paper sheets, place it in a baking oven after the bread has come out, or in the winter into a stove's inside, an Ofenrohr or Kachel. For this you need to know that many German houses of the middle and upper classes had tiled stoves. These stoves would typically be heated from the outside of the room, so the servants would put in the wood from the other side of the wall, but the fire would warm the stoves. And many of these stoves had hollow tiles that go quite a length inside. They radiate the heat the room without smoke or soot, but you could use them to dry things in them. Very nice. Or, as she says, the baking oven after the bread has come out. So this is also how you can use the residual heat. Surely it would always have been done with something. You don't waste heat like that. Laying it out on paper sheets is something we also find in Rumpold and in other contemporary books about baking. Many things that were very fine, very tender, like there is a recipe in Rumpold for something that may actually be baiser, maybe meringue, hard meringue, is laid out on paper and then baked. She does that too. Do not let it burn, she says, but see that they turn nicely crisp to the extent that the dough allows because of the saffron. I wouldn't know why the saffron specifically is singled out, but it is sometimes difficult to get them very hard. Egg noodles don't always turn that crisp. But again, what she wants is basically dried pasta. Keep them in a box in a dry place and they stay good for a quarter of a year or longer. When you have a weak meat soup, throw 10 or 12 into it. And if you want to serve it, let it boil up 1 or 3 times. That way they swell up and the broth tastes very good. Even if it's not bad in itself, it becomes better still. Serve it over sauce. An instant spice noodle soup. I just love this. And she's good for a couple of surprises like this, but this is the last of the surprises that I can give you because it's question time now. Right now, my translations are the translated recipes are only on Facebook. This will depend on whether these translations are online. This would depend on whether I get a book contract, in which case, of course, the translations will go into the book with Prospect Books, or whether not, then I will prepare the translation and put it online. I'm hoping to be able to have a proper blog and website this year. Depends a bit on the time I have available. Next question, the lettuce. What sort of lettuce was used in the chicken for invalids recipe? Not exactly, but if you look at contemporary, herbals, you will see that it's a fairly loose-leafed lettuce. Let me see if I can pull something up quickly. Nope. Nope, sorry. It's a fairly loose-leafed lettuce, and it is shown as not growing into heads. So I usually use either a German Kopfsalat, which is relatively loose-leaf, or actually I use lamb's lettuce, which is not the same thing, I know, but from the flavor comes fairly close. Right. Oh, wonderful. That's excellent. Oh, sweet fat, yes. Schmaltz is its own story. I use the word fat to translate the word schmaltz because schmaltz is the schmaltz is means any fat that has been melted and resolidified. So schmaltz can also refer to butter. It can refer to pig lard. It can refer to goose fat. And that is why I just use fat. I think that sweet fat basically means unsalted schmaltz. So relatively fresh, unpreserved, either goose fat or pig fat or indeed butter. And yes, all the recipes I use today are on Facebook and also in the file that I'm very grateful that was compiled here. And if I may just take the opportunity, on documents, culinary history project, excerpts from Weckerin. Here they are. These are all the translations that I've made so far, and they can also all be found on Facebook. Please do not share them widely. Like I said, I pitched this translation project to Prospect Books, and I'm sure they would not be happy if these showed up on all kinds of other websites. If they say no, I will be happy to have them hosted. Question of the old translations, Edwin. Yes. It's okay to put them up again, but with the disclaimer that all my old translations have pretty big errors in them that I will hope to get around to fixing. Once my website goes up, if I hope to be able to do that later this year, I will have the fixed translations up there. And that means that I would appreciate linking. Until then, please feel free to put them up, but please with a disclaimer that these are buggy. There are some pretty major boo-boos in there. Right. Pleased to meet you. Right. More questions?
Hi. So
Hello.
I'm wondering, I actually first came across Anna Weckerin a few months back in January, prepping, looking for something for a Nordic themed event, and I found her recipe for Lutendronk in a Danish cookbook that was maybe a decade or two past period. So obviously her recipes had been had moved out of Germany and translated into Danish.
Yeah.
I was wondering if you could speak how far abroad beyond just Germany itself was her reach?
Well, this is the Kogebok that you're talking about is a translation of another German cookbook. It's from the Koch- und Kellermeisterei tradition. So Anna Weckerin's recipe for Lutentrank is a parallel of the Koch- und Kellermeisterei recipe. This is a recipe that was fairly common in Germany at the time, apparently. The reach of German cookery at this time is moderate, but mostly north and eastwards. So you find translations of German cookbooks and you find recipes familiar from German cookery radiating out into Scandinavia, and this is not a surprise. You don't find them so much going in the other direction. You don't find a lot of German recipes making their way into France, Italy, or places like this. Her own personal influence, the influence of Anna Wecker as a cookbook author on Scandinavian cooking, was probably not very large. Her cookbook, as far as I can ascertain, was never translated. Other cookbooks that are related were, though. We can generally assume that cookbooks were sort of a fluid genre. One example that I'm currently looking at is Meister Hans. This is from the 1460s, a quarterly recipe collection. Generally assumed to be a singular, a solitary work, the memoirs of a single master cook. It shares recipes, features, whole segments with a lot of manuscripts of around the same time from a similar region. So cookbook writers would happily copy recipes down, and I'm pretty sure that so did Anna Weckerin. Not every recipe in her book was original by her, and that wasn't expected. Right. One last thing about more recipes on Facebook. I'm afraid there's not going to be more Anna Weckerin recipes on Facebook, but I hope starting next week to do a series of recipes, a daily recipe from Meister Hans instead. And I'm hoping that that will satisfy some of you, because I am very sorry that I've stopped the Anna Weckerin recipes. It was simply because I had no more time, and then I wrote the book pitch, and after that, obviously, I couldn't just continue putting them online. I never got around to properly explaining that. The last few weeks were very hectic, but I do hope that I can continue doing that with Meister Hans. Any other questions? All right. Then have fun. I will be logging out of this class now, and if you have any other questions, you can contact me on Facebook. I'll be happy to try and answer. Wally.
Thank you so very much. Vielen Dank.
Yeah, my pleasure.